journey, growing freely, no ceiling, no road. Going deep with no stones to entangle my roots like they do.
Waking up tired and waiting for the horizon to appear. Remind me this work is all for love again. Looking ahead, I see hope in the sky. Give me access and I won't be denied. I won't let go, just hold tight to my hand. The world that we knew would return here. Living my dream without noise.
Sure that will wipe away all tears.
I hate that my hands can't touch you. My arms are so hold to the memories and dreams. Know in my heart that I won't let go. With the beat every day, hard to be unafraid. Everything is not the same no more. Policies stay the same. They should be ashamed. They should try to hide their face. There is a light that I'm chasing in life. It won't be put out, thankful I'm alive. Ready or not, I will rise to a brighter day. A world without wars that divide us. Grateful for all of the memories.
The International Festival of Arts and Ideas is created and produced on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac, in the land we all call home, Connecticut. We hope that from wherever you are, you take a moment to acknowledge and honor the native people whose land you are on and the history of the place you are in.
The International Festival of Arts and Ideas stands in solidarity with Black and Brown communities and other groups who are targeted and abused by unjust systems of oppression. We support all movements working to decenter white voices and dismantle white supremacy. We are actively seeking to dismantle systemic racism, and we raise our voices with those in our community who are already engaged in this vital work. We commit to working alongside you to create transformative change in New Haven and in our global community.
Hi, everyone. What's up? Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for Festival 2021. This is our year of Imagine. Our programming is exploring the world both as it is today and how it can be in the future. Our ideas programming has been thinking about imagining beyond the systems that exist right now into new worlds and new futures we can create together. This is a part of our 26th annual Ideas series. It's made possible with many thanks to support from Connecticut Humanities, Connecticut Public, and viewers like you watching it, supporting it monetarily, energetically, however you show up. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to Imagining a World Without Prisons. My name is Elizabeth Meering. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the curator of Ideas Programming. To know me is to know somebody who is an extremely enthusiastic friend. I am always really excited to get to know each and every one of you. I am so pumped about the group of people you're going to get to spend time with this evening. This conversation is led by an incredible person, Christiana Smith. And to know Kristianna is to know a huge sci-fi nerd and just a brilliant, brilliant person. So without any further ado, Christiana Smith and Imagining a World Without Prisons.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Elizabeth. I would just like prepare us before I invite everyone else out. I have a quote from my favorite author, N.K. Jemisin, and it's the first line of the first book in the Broken Earth series. The book is entitled The Fifth Season, and the line is, "Let's start with the end of the world, why don't we? Get it over with and move on to more interesting things." And that is exactly what tonight is about. This is about having a conversation about what the world looks like when we no longer have prisons, when we no longer have police, when we no longer have means of violence to control one another. So to listen to this wonderful conversation, you need to see the folks who are a part of it. So I'm going to invite our panelists out to introduce themselves. Benji, go ahead and let us know who you are.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much, all the different people who are watching for being here. My name is Benji Hart. I go by they, them pronouns. I'm an author, I'm an artist, and an educator. I'm originally from Amherst, Massachusetts, but I'm currently living in Chicago, which is occupied Miami and Potawatomi territory. And I am deeply invested in police and prison abolition, and particularly supporting youth efforts and movements for police and prison abolition here in Chicago. And to know me is to know a dancer. I love to dance, and I don't think anything, I was thinking about the other day, I don't think there's anything else in the world that brings me more joy than dancing. So to know me is to know a dancer.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for being here. Derica, tell us a little bit about you.
Hi, my name is Derica. I'm from St. Louis originally. I'm sort of living all over the East Coast right now. I'm trying to sort out my life and next steps. To know me, what is to know me? Benji had such a good answer and stole mine. So now I feel like I have to do something. No, I can't do it. I literally can't do it. To know me is to know that I'm a child of a comedian. So that is to know me. And I'll pass it back to you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for being here. And last but not least, Dylan, introduce yourself to us.
I'll do my best. I'm Dylan Rodriguez, he, him pronouns. I'm talking to you from Southern California on occupied Kauai and Tongva land. I work at University of California, Riverside, which is about a block and a half away from a gas station where the Riverside Police Department stole the life of Taisha Miller in 1998. To know me is to know someone who has been humbly struggling and working and thinking and trying to create some joy and beauty, as well as thrive in anger and rage with people that have been veteran and emerging people in abolitionist movement for about almost the last 25 years, since around 1997, when I was graciously invited to participate in some work. And so I think that's for this community that we're in right now. I think that's one of the things I'd like to say. And in that sense, I consider myself to be a lifelong student, most importantly, as well as someone who embraces the responsibilities of being a teacher, being a writer, being a thinker, but always trying to do it in some kind of collective context, in community with people. Because I think that's the only thing that really matters to me at this point, especially at this historical moment. So that's my short introduction of myself.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here. If I could actually throw the first one back to the first sort of question I have, I just think that it'd be nice for folks to have an understanding of what we mean when we say abolition. So do you have like a one sentence version of like abolition means this?
This is for Dylan?
For Dylan, yeah.
Oh, got you. Oh, we're good. All right. Yes, I do. It's more than one sentence. I hope that's okay. You can just cut me off if you want. It's about three or four sentences. So the thing I want to emphasize in 2021 is abolition comes from a Black radical and revolutionary diasporic tradition. We have to say that over and over again so it doesn't get abstracted and pushed away from that grounding. And as is characteristic of so much of the Black radical and revolutionary tradition, abolition is extraordinary in its grace, in its invitation, to all kinds of other struggling insurgent human beings to participate in the shared responsibilities and creative struggles of abolitionists. That's the first part of the definition I want to emphasize, that is grounded in diasporic Black revolutionary work. Abolition's collective and creative revolt and insurgency struggle against the normalized violence and asymmetrical war of civilization with a capital C, that project, that genocidal project, from its founding moments until tomorrow. And then last thing is that abolition is, in my view, most importantly, as we are, I think, trying to exemplify right here, right now, is a thriving of collective creative projects that try to build community knowledge art that's premised on the necessity of liberation from civilization and the immediate defense and freedom of people in places that are targeted by civilizational genocide.
I just need a minute. Thank you so much for that. So, founded by Black radicals, it is the project against violence that is being created by colonization, and it's an exercise in radical imagination. Did I get that? Did I surmise that correctly? Benji, is there anything you'd like to add on to that?
I would add to the already beautiful and poetic definition that Dylan offers. I would add that it is focused on police, prisons, and I would also argue the military should and needs to be included as systems of violence that are rooted in colonialism, rooted in chattel slavery, rooted in imperialism, and seeing the abolition, the permanent and complete undoing of those systems, because as these movements and terms get co-opted, you need to underline that, like, abolition means the whole thing is gone. Seeing that as part of, as Dylan said, a long tradition of Black and colonized people's struggles against these violent systems, and seeing those systems as kind of a linchpin, as really, for me, I think of it as like a thread that begins the unraveling of all systems of harm and violence. So yes, we start with police, prisons, and the military, but in order for there to be no police, prisons, and military, the occupation of land can no longer be a thing. The way we do healthcare can no longer be a thing. The way we do education can no longer be a thing. So we begin with this conversation around the violence of the police, prison, and military systems. But when we pull that thread, we see all the different interconnected systems of violence and white supremacy and colonialism that must also be undone, that must also be reimagined, or replaced with just systems if we're going to actually live in a free world, if we're going to actually live in an anti-capitalist, decolonized, no more white supremacy type of world.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And then Derica, if you couldn't guess, I'm coming to you. Is there anything you would like to add or, flower even more onto this definition?
Yeah, I love both definitions so much. I've been sitting with the Black radical revolutionary tradition because I absolutely think of the different traditions of abolition, and I'm fortunate and I'm hopeful, and I'm always striving to be in the Black radical revolutionary tradition. Sometimes I'm sure I fail, but that's the tradition I love that's being uplifted right now. I think probably the most simplest way I try to communicate abolition to people is the eradication of oppressive systems and the eradication of the reasons why people think they need oppressive systems at the same time, over time, towards obsolescence, and the building up of societies that help us thrive. So I pull that from lots of different sources, from people like Rachel Herzing, from organizations like Critical Resistance, for people who have been, I love also the word insurgent, who've been practicing abolition in ways that we don't probably tend to think about as abolitionist practices, but people who forge and use diversity of tactics to get free. And so looking at these different traditions, looking at these different organizations and people who theorize, think, and practice, and that that's where that definition is sort of coming from.
Thank you all so much, because that was like a gorgeous intro, like an intro Abolition 101 in 5 minutes. I would like to, Derica, if I could give it back to you, I would really love to piggyback off of something you just said, which is like there are people practicing. So could you share like an example or a few of like places where folks could look and see abolition happening right now?
Yes, what's hard, and I wrestle with this question all the time, with some like specific answer to this, even though I think there are lots of answers, is the fact that there are lots of answers. So when Ruth Wilson Gilmore says that abolition means that we need to change one thing and that's everything, to give then one example of abolition in practice is hard because it requires us to think about, well, what lies at the intersection of disability justice and environmental justice and anti-capitalism and reduces our reliance on the police. And so when we think about it that way, there are infinite examples of what could be abolitionists in the making. What's sometimes complicated is, at least what I'm still honestly as a student of abolition working out, is whether the people who have political consciousness of those activities consider them abolition, and then what do we make of that when they don't, right? And so there's people who I hear often say, we do abolition at my mama's house. If something goes down, we don't call the police, we handle it among ourselves. And in some ways, it's like, sure, that could be abolition. It could be if you're intentioning for it to be over and against the carceral state, but it's not a commitment to necessarily dismantle or eradicate like the carceral state. And so I'm in this quasi place where I'm trying to think about specific examples. I do think that organizations from California, people who are working on projects like Alternative to 911, who are helping people to build, like the Oakland Power Projects that Critical Resistance has done in the past, who help people think about other ways to build responses to harm, community-based violence that doesn't rely on calling the police for intervention. Some people will point to like cahoots as an example of like an abolitionist practice, but what's complicated again is not towards the eradication of the carceral state. It's a great alternative. I love a lot of the work that's actually happened in like sex worker spaces and trans spaces that build like houses and communities of care where you can't rely on police to come and figure out a problem because it can land somebody in jail. I don't even know. Like, there are people who are organizing for housing for everyone because they believe that, look, if we make sure that people have access to housing, they're less likely to be in precarious situations. And when you're in precarious situations, you're more than likely to come in contact with the police. So there are people who are choosing to organize through housing in order to accomplish like an abolitionist future. There are people who are organizing against debt because that also removes precarity. There are people who are organizing against toxic masculinity. They're trying to change and impact like young boys to not be physically violent when they experience rejection from someone through an abolitionist framework, right? I'm thinking of Asada's daughters. So there's so many different examples of like abolition in practice, but we have to think about, is this over and against the carceral state? Like, is this building up the kinds of people and communities and society and world that we want? And then how are we doing that collectively? And so I always get overwhelmed by that question, but that's sort of as examples.
Yeah, thank you. Those are incredible examples. And I hear you when you say like, this could be a seed for something that we do in the future. We could like take this practice and we could grow it. But is that practice actually fighting against the incarceral state? Is it actually dismantling or undoing the thing that is currently overriding the rest of our existence? Benji, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, I loved the nuances of Derica's answer, and I agree that it's a complicated question because on the one hand, there are literally uncountable examples of of people living in a police and prison-free world or striving for non-carceral solutions. And I think also the hardest thing to hold is that at the same time, there are no examples because we don't live in a police and prison-free world yet.
Exactly.
So we don't actually know what that world looks like. We can create moments or bubbles or spaces, but how do we actually solve X problem in a police and prison-free world? We can't really answer that question, honestly, because we're not yet living in that world yet. And this is the imagination that both Dylan and Derica already referred to, that we are looking to what our communities are already doing for inspiration, and yet we have yet to arrive at a police and prison-free world. We have yet to arrive at abolition, which means it's still an imagining process. And so there's lots of places to look for inspiration. And I think on the one hand, we have oppressed communities to look to. We have undocumented communities. We have trans communities. We have sex workers, we have Black and brown folks, period. And then I think the other complicated, and Derek already gave great examples of that, like sex workers are not calling the police when there's an issue. Undocumented people are not calling ICE to help them solve their problems. They understand inherently that ICE is not there to help keep them safe. And many people, whether they call themselves abolitionists or not, function with that understanding. Like police make the situation less safe. ICE makes the situation less safe. Why would I call them when I'm experiencing a crisis? But then I think the flip of that is another complicated, I think equally complicated example is communities of wealth and communities of privilege who often live and function without police, who are also definitively not abolitionist communities. You know what I'm saying? Those communities are made possible by white supremacy. Those communities are made possible. The excesses and the privileges of those communities are directly the result of the exact systems we're talking about abolishing. And at the same time, there's so many folks who say, what are we going to do without the police, who actually never interact with the police. There's so many people who say, how do we live in a world without prisons, who have never been to a prison, don't know anybody who has been to a prison, have never even seen a prison in some cases. And I'm going to actually drop an article in the chat that I think is a great supplement to this conversation from Tamara K. Noper, called Abolition is Not a Suburb, where I think she does a great job of talking about how, yes, we have examples of police and prison-free communities, and also wealthy white communities are not what we're trying to emulate in our vision of abolition. So just to recap, I'm kind of jumping off Erica to agree and say, Derica to agree and say that we have tons of examples of abolition, and also we're not there yet. So these are a lot of these are us practicing and us flexing our muscles and us looking for images and ideas that we can maybe cull from for a police and prison-free world, but we're not in a police and prison-free world yet. So that commitment to actually getting there, that commitment, as Derica also said, of actually arriving there, which means fighting these systems, demanding for the end of these systems, and insurgency against these systems is actually a really important part of the process.
Yeah. I often I love this because I often tell people, using the metaphor of white supremacy or all of these systems of oppression as a house, that there are some people who are building the foundation for the other house, and there are people who need to build the scaffolding to get us from a house on fire that's falling apart to a better system way of being. And so it's sometimes hard to be okay, well, this person built this part of the scaffolding, but that person is still very much in this house that's on fire, and how do we say it's so many different parts of the problem and of the system. That's why it's overwhelming for folks, because it's such a large system and complex interconnected systems. I would like to invite us into, I think that through those two answers we got this really beautiful idea of how the challenges, and I do want to invite us deeper into this idea of imagining what's next. So I have the question I would like to ask is okay, so if we snap our fingers, magically there are no systems of oppression, what does the world look like? And one of them for me that I think about a lot is just around the idea of transformative justice, which I would say is solving conflict and harm without the use of the police or the criminal justice system as it exists today. And I would love to hear whatever you have added on. Dylan, I'm going to come to you with this question, which is so when we think about things like people being jury members or people doing the actual act of calling the police, in a world where they no longer exist, what do normal people do? How are normal people interacting with a system of transformative justice?
Is it cool if I think about your previous question in connection with this one? Because I see
absolutely.
Them as, okay, I just want to make sure that's
absolutely.
All right. Well, one thing I feel obligated to do for us collectively as maybe part of the ongoing work of defining abolition, which, by the way, I know that we did our little crystallized version, but that's part of the practice of abolition is you're always fucking defining it, right? And you're arguing about it and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't, and how maybe a definition you had yesterday is against all your intuition created a form of oppressive violence somewhere else. So I mean, when we say definition, that actually is the work of abolition. Right, the work of including defining abolition itself. So So one thing that critical resistance taught me, that's the community that I was invited into in 1997, right? So it's what humbled me, but what it's also taught me over a long period of time is that we got to stop thinking about abolition as some kind of outcome, as an end point. That's not what it is. And if you look at the Black radical revolutionary tradition of abolitionist practitioners, certainly there were particular objectives and goals. You wanted the plantation to burn. You wanted to be free from chattel slavery. I mean, so there was immediate and necessary objectives. But abolition, is most robust concept, is what the great Black radical theorist and scholar and artist Sylvia Wynter would call a praxis of being human. That's what abolition actually is. It is an ongoing practice, an ongoing art, an ongoing theorization, ongoing debate. And so part of what I also wanted to frame your second question with is the notion that part of what that praxis of human being does is it acknowledges that we are living in a condition of normalized asymmetrical warfare, right? In the sense it is normalized, but it is also entirely war, and it is entirely asymmetrical. In other words, you can't just draw easy comparisons about casualties as they target particular people, bodies, and communities. So we have to know our premise first, right? Because otherwise we fall into the trap of liberal humanism where everybody's fucking equally targeted. That's where the phrase, by the way, that's why I resist the phrase mass incarceration, okay? Because I think it's been kind of pulled out of some of its originating context of the 90s and early 2000s, where it was clearly referring to an analysis of anti-Black policing and anti-Black incarceration. So it was implicit in the term mass incarceration. Now I'm not so sure. I think demographically and empirically, we know what the incarcerated people are, right? But there's a weird way that the politics gets pulled back into a kind of liberalism where it's about, oh, we're all affected by it. No, we're fucking not, right? And that's why in a state of war, right, you have asymmetrical war. The state is waging war on people, on certain people, against certain people, on behalf of certain other people. That's why it's asymmetrical. So it doesn't work like that. So that's to say that when we think about something like transformative justice, for example, right, and think about its purposes, which is, to kind of generate a community-based notion of the term that's usually used as accountability, right? And that this is what real justice looks like. You have reparation, you have healing, you have kind of mutual engagement, whatnot. The thing that I'm going to raise is how all these processes are immediately targets of appropriation and deforming by the state. So what you actually see in this moment are district attorneys' offices, increasing numbers of district attorneys' offices and other administrations, university and college administrations, that are seizing the terms of transformative justice and actually trying to implement them in their own entirely punitive, entirely anti-Black, colonial, racist, and misogynist, and transphobic, and queerphobic, and everything else process. So when you have the fucking cops and DA who are actually doing the implementation, or at least are like hovering over the implementation of so-called transformative justice, then you are in fucking trouble, right? But by the way, this is how war works, right? You have insurgency and then you have counterinsurgency. And that's the other key term I wanted to introduce as part of this question. We have to understand how counterinsurgency works. And we're in a moment of reformist counterinsurgency. So I just want to caution us, not just the six of us that are here, but I'm saying everybody who's listening and everyone's going to listen, to think dynamically and constantly and critically about how they would respond to your question, right? Like what's going on right now. Okay, so let's raise maybe what's happening right now that is potentially transformative, that is carrying with it an abolitionist logic, an abolitionist spirit, an abolitionist community, abolitionist commitment. We have to be really careful about how that gets potentially expropriated by others. And the last thing I'll say is that you see this happening very concretely in the strange ways that certain people, I'm talking about, social media influencers, academics, prominent executive directors of nonprofit organizations, certain, community-based activists and pundits that are now branding themselves as abolitionists, but who have very little or no connection with actual abolitionist movements, communities, organizations, or people. Okay, so the other thing, abolition is not an identity. Let's just get that shit out of the way. It is not an identity. Abolition is a collective practice. It means nothing without that. So I know that was sort of a non-answer, but kind of it was an answer to your question, Kristianna, because I think it's about vigilance. We have to be vigilant about how it is that we are kind of embracing, and then always also having to be, deeply skeptical and questioning of what's happening around us, given what Benji and Derek have said, right? That we are still in the context of domestic warfare.
Yeah. So thank you for that. Like, thank you for like all of that. And I like so appreciate the naming of assimilation, right? Because like for me, I'm like, you're not anti-racist, people. Like, stop saying anti-racism when you don't actually care about dismantling white supremacy, and you are going to keep moving in white supremacy no matter what. And so like, again, like I so appreciate that. Actually, in this moment, I feel like I like to like call things as they're happening, right? Like we're actually in this moment where I'm like, let's imagine. And it's like, here are all the reasons we can't imagine, which are real. And it's also incumbent upon us to actually do the work of imagination. So I'm so curious if anybody's right now like, this is what I envision the world being. I envision the world being, we are way smaller. We're not as interconnected. I imagine, like, what is it that we imagine the world being? Or I would love to know how you reground yourself in imagination when there is when we could spend all of our time defending ourselves, right?
In my one-line response, because I already took my turn, my one-line response to that question, because I didn't answer that part of the question, like we imagine it because we're already actually manifesting it in moments like the one we are creating right now. Right. So that's what I would say. It's like it's not some kind of far off projection of something else. Like look at the forms of human being that you are practicing against domestic war, against anti-Black, criminalization, policing, and state violence. Like those forms of community and being and creating and building and rage, right? And beauty and joy, like all that shit. That is what the abolitionist way of existing looks like and feels like. And so I think it's about carrying that forward, sustaining it, reproducing it. So I'm going to just encourage that it's actually here. We just have to imagine from where we are at. That makes sense.
Yeah, if I can jump in really quickly, I interestingly didn't hear Dylan's answer as a non-answer to the question. I think what's very, very, very important, at least for me, what I try to remember, is that imagination is neutral, right? It's not inherently good. It's not inherently powerful. It's not inherently a thing that we should aspire to do. And counterinsurgency is imagination, right? COINTELPRO is imagination. The Ghetto Informer Program is imagination. And so what I actually hear Dylan is reminding us is the potential of the potential of imagination and response to our imagination. And that's why this is so important. That's why the diligence is so important. Because we don't also imagine the counterinsurgency we're going to be up against. That's what impedes our ability to practice and build the things that we imagine. Which is why sometimes when I'm in conversation with people who I think would otherwise be sympathetic to abolition, and that's where I love having most conversations, not with people who are already sold, but people who are sort of considerers and abolition curious. And they'll say, oh, I'm with you. We need to build the thing first, build the world first, imagine the world first, and then we can start reducing our reliance on the police. And I'll say, well, when there have been attempts to build the world that we want, the police has infiltrated that, right? When people have been building community health clinics, which is one thing I dream about, when they have been doing street violence interruption without cops, when they have been flipping gang members into political activists, right? When they were doing free breakfast programs. So when all that imagination was happening and it was leading and manifesting in radical outcomes, the police were the people who intervened and disrupted that imagination, disrupted those dreams. So we can't talk about imagination in isolation of the counterinsurgency aspect, because as we're imagining and dreaming the world that we're building, we also know it's not as if we're going to get the answers right. And the police are going to be like, woo, good job, you don't need us anymore. Right? Because they have now created a storyline where they feel threatened by the possibilities of our imagination. And so I actually hear counterinsurgency as a fixture of imagination, a practice of imagination.
That's
But
right.
people have guns and resources, right? And we have to figure out now not only how to imagine the world that we want, but we have to imagine our resistance in wake of that counterinsurgency. So I think that I was hearing a bit of a tension, but I think we can resolve that tension by seeing
Absolutely.
by recognizing forms of imagination.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Yes. Benji,
I have so many things to say because Derica and Dylan have already dropped so many beautiful and important things that have me riled up. But I love that imagination is neutral. I love that phrase. And like, let's be real, that the police are the result of someone's imagination. The prison system is the result of someone's imagination. The US settler colonial project is the result of someone's imagination. So imagination is not inherently good or bad, is not inherently violent or non-violent, is not inherently anything.
Right.
It's how we sharpen our imagination and to what end, exactly as Derica said. And I think Dylan introducing the term counterinsurgency is so important because we have always been in the midst of counterinsurgent responses to our radical movements, but especially after the uprisings of 2020, particularly the language of abolition, particularly the language of defund, the language of transformative justice is being so rapidly co-opted, and it is very intentional. It's not people trying to join in with the movement and being a little clunky with it, because that's a natural part of the movement building process. When we say counterinsurgency, we're talking about people actually trying to stop our radical imagination from actually being allowed to flourish intentionally, not accidentally, very intentionally. And I think that's actually really important to talk about under this question, because even terms that we, even some of us as abolitionists, I definitely catch myself like accidentally using sometimes, like reimagine the police and prison system or replace the police and prison system. That those terms are actually counterinsurgent terms because they get us stuck in the idea that we need to take what's not working about the system and replace what it's trying to do with something, rather than understanding that these systems we're talking about, the police, prison, and military systems, are doing precisely what they're created to do, and we do not need to replace them with anything. And I think that's actually really important. Like, I think a small example of that could be like the war on drugs. Like, we don't need to replace the war on drugs with something. The war on drugs was anti-Black counterinsurgent effort on the part of the federal government. And so we don't look at the war on drugs and go, yeah, this really failed to like get people to like make our community safer. How do we replace the war on drugs with a different effort? It's like, no, the war on drugs did exactly what it was supposed to do. We don't need to replace it. And believing that the police and prison systems are here to serve and protect, are here to keep us safe, are here to hold people accountable is not only ahistorical, they were not created to do any of those things. It then gets us stuck in the mind frame that we need to somehow replace them rather than actually imagining we don't need them at all. So when I hear like in an abolitionist world, what would your role be in a world without police and prisons? What would your role be? I really want to push people to think like your role could be a mom. Your role could be a gardener. Your role could be an educator. Your role could be so many things. It doesn't have to be, what is the alternative to a juror? What is the alternative to a police officer? You don't need one. You don't need one. We don't need to create alternatives to those things. And that's not to say that we don't need to imagine new systems and structures, but it's actually really important to name that we don't need new systems and structures to replace the old ones. We need new systems and structures that are counter to everything that these current systems and structures are.
Yeah, I mean, just to amplify Benji's point. I mean, your role is to fucking live and thrive and defend. That's your fucking role in an abolitionist way of being, which is right now, as well as in the abolitionist world that you are creating. That is your role. And I just want to also honor the fact that we're talking about imagination here, and to say we got to understand how powerful the collective praxis of imagination actually is as abolitionist insurgency. Think about how liberal to reactionary elements, right? I'm talking about from the Biden crowd all the way to the Promise Keepers and whatnot, right? Think about how they have these different ways of reacting strongly and oppressively to radical abolitionist anti-colonial imagination. They cannot take it. They experience it as violence against them. And you know what? In a way, they're right? Because it is actually destructive of their way of understanding the world and their place and their entitlement to live as they do. So this is to say that I want to say, imagination is something we have to embrace as an absolutely indispensable abolitionist tool, weapon, pedagogy, however you need to kind of tactically use it. Imagination is so critical to all this, but it's to say that it's part of war, right? The war is between structures of imagination and how they get institutionalized, and then how other people are trying to imagine against that institutionalization.
Yeah. I I think that thank you for everything. There was something in the way that Benji was talking about the question that I was like, oh, I actually am asking this other question, but thank you for saying, because I agree, hey, you can just be a mom. Hey, you could just be a human. And I think that the question I'm actually asking is, in a world in which people have only learned to build community through mechanisms and systems of violence, how do people learn how to build community with one another without becoming counterinsurgents, the next level, not the intentional counterinsurgents, but without being oh, that sounds good that my local police department's going to have a transformative justice youth program. How do people who do not have the base of community building start that process for themselves? Or where can they recognize that the process of community building in themselves? Because I think that there are people who are listening to this conversation and who know exactly what y'all are saying. And there are people who are listening to this conversation and they're like, but I don't know how to, I don't get it, right? So how do those people learn how to build community with one another without the assistance of systems that we are naming as violent, because they are violent and they are intended to hurt Black, brown, queer, trans, undocumented people? And that's really anybody can jump up for that one.
I can start because I like that question a lot. I think it's a great question. And I really would love to hear from other folks too, because I know this is what folks are doing. This is the meat of it, the heart of it. But for me, to let folks into my deep dreams, my radical imagination, I very often try and picture what I just want my block to look like. Just in the ideal conditions, what does my block look like? And for me, I picture me knowing all of my neighbors, me having relationships with all of my neighbors. I picture lots of green space. I picture young people being able to play safely outside. I picture an abundance of food, much of it growing in people's yards. I picture folks coming together to cook together, to maintain the neighborhood together, to watch each other's kids, to play. And then I ask myself, what are steps that I can do to help create that reality? A lot of it starts with just getting to know my neighbors, with being outside to greet people, with taking steps so that I can actually build those relationships and invite people. I think invitation is a great word. Invite people into that vision of our community and also meet other people's imaginations. But I think the other reason for me that envisioning is important is then I also ask, okay, what's stopping that from being a reality right now? I'm really not able to communicate with this person because their mental health is struggling, and sometimes they're actually not present with me. So that's one reason I don't have a relationship with this one neighbor. This other neighborhood is transphobic, and they talk about me when I walk out the house dressed a certain way. So that's a block for our relationship building. And then I ask what are the things that could actually, those barriers that I'm experiencing, what are the things that could break down that barrier? And it's never the police. It's never that person should be locked up or that person should be arrested or I need a police officer in front of my house so that they can protect me from the transphobic person, because the police aren't going to protect me. They're going to target me. So I'm not going to call them to help me deal with transphobia in my neighborhood. You understand me? So I think I want to say on a very fundamental level, relationship building and actually getting to know the people in our sphere is one of the most important tools in helping us arrive at a place where we can actually rely on each other and rely on community, and not imagine that the police and prison system can fill the voids that are actually voids in our community and voids in our relationships. But then I think the other thing that helps me do is then ask, okay, and what is actually materially, fundamentally stopping me from building those relationships, stopping us from building those relationships? What resources, what supports, what kind of community culture do I want to build? Do I want to pull in? Do I want to demand that can help me achieve that vision?
Thank you so much. And I just asked if we could like put sort of those steps that you just outlined, because I think for some people, like that's where they're at. And I think that it's really important to like baby step or have steps. Derica, you unmuted, so go ahead.
Oh yeah, I love that so much. And Benji, we should talk offline about how in the book, because it's literally that. It's like almost verbatim. It's like shocking. Like it's not shocking, but it's exciting. Because
What book?
A lot of that. We can talk about that later. But I want to talk about this question because I also love this question. I think that's why social movements are so important. I know there's a lot of energy usually for people to get over it with the protest, move on to the next thing. What's the policy? What's the action? What's the demand? But in social movements, I think that's where a lot of people began to question their assumptions, their relationship to the world, their relationships to other people, their relationship to ideas, and they began to interrogate that. So when I was in college, what I would have said, the kind of world I wanted, has rapidly shifted, like in the past 10, 15 years. It has rapidly shifted. One reason why it shifted is because I've been a part of several social movements that politicize me around different ideas. I've been in relationships with different people who've politicized me around different ideas. And I've had different political homes that have pushed me around different ideas. So in college, the new Jim Crow came out, I was just open to an entire world around the criminal legal system. When Chris Kobach was writing, do I look illegal laws in other parts of the country, like the Arizona Bill 1020, SB 1020, that empowered police to stop people on the basis of how they look, right, in order to empower cops to do immigration work, right? I was politicized around that issue because I was a part of an organization who taught me about that issue, and we argued about it. And so being in spaces with other people, not doing these, racial justice book lists, which I think can be cool, for an individual. But I think if you are trying to be a part of that world and do that work, it's very important to do that collectively by being a part of an organization or finding a political home that challenges you around radical political education. And so through those political homes I've had over time, I learned this very important word that Dylan said in his answer to the first question, which is tradition, right? I have to figure out which traditions do I belong to. And I started learning just because Black people said justice, it didn't mean that we meant the same thing. Or just because people said the word freedom and love, it didn't mean the same thing. So I had to figure out, these sorts of people are saying justice because they're interested in maintaining the procedural justice systems that we have, and they want to keep them intact. These people are saying justice because they're antagonistic to the systems that we have in place. And I became more attracted to those group of people, to the people who belong to the Black radical tradition, right? I started reading more about that. I started looking for scholars and looking for organizers who belong in that tradition. And that's where I found new political homes with new arguments and new questions, right? Like the purpose of revolutions is to generate new questions and new ideas and new people. And I found the revolutionary spaces more attractive instead of the stagnant spaces that try to preserve the status quo. And if you don't have a political education, if you aren't getting a political analysis, it can be hard to decipher which traditions you're in because it all sounds good. When Obama gets on Twitter and says, at the verdict for Derek Chauvin after murdering George Floyd, this may not be justice, but it's a step in the right direction. You may feel affirmed by that because you're like, woo, I feel relief. I knew this isn't justice, but this is a step in the right direction. And then you have other people who say, this isn't justice. This is, a cop being offered up as a sacrificial lamb, to preserve the system of policing. And we know this because the prosecutor said, this isn't an anti-police prosecution. This is a pro-police prosecution. You have to ask, which tradition am I in, right? Am I in the tradition that's not calling this justice because I get to largely keep everything intact? Or am I in the tradition of people who realize that this isn't justice because justice will require the participation of the person impacted by the killing, and it's impossible for that to happen because George Floyd is not here because he was executed by the state, right? So we have to ask which traditions that we're in. So I love the getting to know your neighbor. I love getting to imagine what your block look like. And as Benji said, most importantly, the commitment to making that possible, right? It's just not, oh, I wish this was different. Oh, I just don't wish I knew the person next door. It's taking the risk sometimes to knock, right? To go with another person to knock, to ask, is there an organization here? Is there a collective here? Who's doing work here in the traditions that I believe in? And so I love both of those answers, and I'll pass it back to you.
Oh my gosh. I almost started, like, I'm just so full from this. I don't want to talk too long because I want to hear what Dylan says, but like, thank you so much, Derica, because I think it's so important for people to find a political home and to continue, not to like suspiciously question your political home, but like to make sure that that's the political home that you actually feel home in, that your political home is like pushing you to continue to imagine, to continue to be in line with what you believe, or if your political home is offering you like a false catharsis in a moment. So I think that like that was such a gorgeous answer. Dylan, anything that you would like to share?
Really just to try to punctuate in an open-ended way what Benji and Derek have offered around this, which I'm still taking in. I come back to something that Benji actually mentioned in their opening comments, which is the concept of security. Really, I think Benji, you mentioned something about how the current way of doing healthcare cannot continue. Right. And that raises for me the issue of an abolitionist concept of security, which is really what we're saying. We're talking about the fucking block, right? Like we're talking about a place that is secure, that is safe. Ideally, that you actually feel a kind of identification with the people around you, even if you don't like them. You know what I mean? Like if you don't like them, you're still gonna. I got your back because you're in my block, right? I got your back because you're in my block, even though we have beef. Where people are looking out for each other's loved ones, their elders, their children. I mean, that's the ideal version of it, right? But I wanted to think about an abolitionist notion of security, which is in immediate and direct opposition and antagonism to the existence of the police and the criminal justice system. And that is because an abolitionist or even liberated anti-colonial, black radical, black revolutionary notion of security, what it means is some version of housing security, of food security, of educational security, of course, of health security, as Benji raised, of recreational security. Right, recreational security, security to access that which is aesthetic and beautiful and collective and joyful, right? In addition to all the other rudimentary needs of flesh and blood, which I think sometimes we lose, right? But to me, that's the most robust practice of abolitionist community. And the other thing too to keep in mind is that because these attempts and these projects, and for that matter, these imaginaries of the block and of the community and of whatever it might be, the commune, whatever it might be, we need to understand that these are guerrilla projects, or you can call them maroon projects, or projects of fugitivity, or projects of decolonization and anti-colonialism, that for the foreseeable future, we need to understand that is the position that those projects take in relation to the United States of America, right? A civilization with a capital C, right? With this modern kind of Western genocidal project that we have differently inhabited and forcefully inherited. So everything we're talking about is an antagonism. It is an antagonism, an irreconcilable antagonism against the logics and institutions that actually surround that attempted fugitive guerrilla, self-defining, autonomous, liberated project. So I just want to emphasize that because this is what helps prepare us to both advance and defend the project.
Yes. And my like high school existence was a Latin nerd, so like I can't resist looking up the etymology of a thing. Like it's adverse to my being. And so as you were talking, right, you were using the word security, and my brain immediately was like security guard, defend. Like I was already at defend, and then you started talking about security, and you were like housing security, like food security, and I was like, Bitch, what does the word security mean? Because I'm not like, what are you trying? And so I looked up the etymology of security really quick, and it means without care, meaning like I can have this thing, I can have housing without care, like without worry. I can have these things without worry. And like how quickly even that word security has been like twisted by the world that we live in to be about like violence towards, when really it's about like grounding within. And like how beautiful, like I was just having this moment like, oh, this is a decolonization happening in my mind right now around this word that truly is about you being able to be where you are. And how there's also a balance here around like, once I am where I am, the reality of the world that we currently live in means I'm going to have to figure out how to keep that without the insurgency or the violence of the world that like doesn't want you to be like, capitalism can't survive if you feel good by yourself, if you're housed and fed and like whole. So yeah, that just happened in my brain now. I wanted to share it with y'all quickly. We are like zooming in on time. So one of the things that I wanted to ask was just a little bit about y'all. One, I'm not going to let us leave here without plugging people's books or projects. So if you like, I'm against humility. I think humility is white supremacy. So we will be talking about Derica's book. We will be talking about Dylan's book. We'll be talking about a book in which both of them are a part of. We're going to be talking about Benji's work. I'm just plugging it in so everybody understands that we're allowed to know that we're amazing. We're allowed to be secure in our amazingness and share that with other people. But my question is like, how has your life changed since becoming a student of abolition, since like being on this path and coming into contact? How has your like existence, whether that's like a physical, whether that's a mental, whether that's relational, just like how have you changed since undertaking this work for yourself? And I'm gonna give it to Derica first. Also, Derica, what's the name of your book?
Oh, the name of the book is Becoming Abolitionist, Police Protest in the Pursuit of Freedom.
And when does it come out?
October 4th or 5th, October 4th.
Thank you. You should go look it up on Instagram because the cover is gorgeous. I'm sure the insides are also gorgeous.
Oh, thank you.
You're so welcome. So what, how has your life changed since starting to become a student of abolition?
Wow, how has my life changed? Well, what's interesting is that when I'll start with the book and then kind of go backwards. When I started writing the book, I had been debating on going into a PhD program because I thought I needed all of the answers to sort of figure out this violence question. And then I got convinced by Robin Kelly to like write the book, and I was like, well, this is terrifying. And when I started writing the book, I found myself being politicized around abolition all over again in different ways, and realized how much I disagreed with myself when some of my early thinking around abolition, and have been grateful because I've been pushed to think differently about abolition by the time I finished the book than when I began the book. One thing that I realized my life has changed is it's complicated because, as Dylan said, abolition is sort of an iterative and collective process. But I realized that I felt grateful from the sense of responsibility to having certain kinds of conversations with people who are close to me around harm, around violence, around the best traditions of imagination that I believed in. And I think that I always had some sort of an evangelistic spirit because I'm an Aries, and I was a certain kind of conservative Christian in my late teens, early 20s. And so I remember having different kinds of conversations with my family after being politicized around abolitionist traditions. And I think that's so important because it's really easy, I think at least, to do a lot of that trash talking online, to like come for like people who come for you, to like write something and go viral, or to like perform a certain kind of politic on a panel. But it's very different when you're in your, someone's house that you love, and you start talking about not believing in the system that has police or prisons, and then they challenge you on it. And it can become an abstract conversation. and then something goes down in your family, and it's different than not calling the police, right? It's like, well, how do we have like a conversation in response to this harm, and how do we do that over and against the criminal legal system? Or how do we have certain kinds of conversations now to prevent violence from happening, a certain kind of violence from happening in our family or among friends? And so it definitely has pushed me to become more serious about the kinds of relationships that I'm forging, like in my families, in my communities, knowing my neighbors, right? Which is weird, because I've always had to know my neighbors, because that's who I depend on for survival for most of my life, right? So then after law school, I shifted in class. I became a reluctant member of the petite bourgeoisie, and now I have like a different life. And now it's like, well, how do I continue to maintain these relationships and practice the thing that I believe in, and to do that with other people who I believe now we both like depend on each other for our survival. And I think that's like a very abstract way of just sort of saying that I wanted to ensure that the politics that I believed in weren't only manifesting in my political organizations, in my political homes, online, or in like the writing that I do, but they also manifested like practically with my family, with the people who I'm in love with people who I struggle with my children who are my favorite Marxist, surrealist, abolitionists in the world, right? So how do I make sure that I'm practicing what I preach? And, you know, I'm learning how to preach what I practice. Like, it's both. Like, how am I learning both? And so I'll stop there.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Whew. Benji, would you like to go next?
Sure. It's actually a huge question. I'm like, dang, how do I respond to this question? I think I'll start by saying an important thing for me to underline about abolition is it's, yes, a part of the Black radical tradition, but I would argue that it's also specifically actually hood knowledge, that it comes from actually the knowledge of poor and working class Black people. And for me, as a very light-skinned middle class Black person, I think that's really important to say, because I actually come from a police family. I was not raised to see police as threatening or my enemy. And it wasn't until I was 18 years old and was staying with friends of mine in the Bronx, and I was attacked by 4 police officers, that I really started to understand, like, okay, something is wrong with this system. And I think as an 18-year-old, I didn't have language, I didn't have analysis, but that really violent and really unprovoked moment was definitely a part of my radicalization. And as a middle class Black person, as a Black person with police officers in my family, it wasn't, as someone who does this work a lot, one of the main kinds of pushback I get is like, oh, well, this is some theoretical academic idea. It's not grounded in anyone's real lived reality. And I have to tell people, I didn't learn about abolition in college. I didn't learn about abolition in class. I didn't learn about abolition in my middle class nuclear family. I learned about it in the hood. I learned about it from my poor and working extended family members. I learned about it from my poor and working class friends who were like, we don't fuck with 12. We don't call the cops. Like, don't snitch. Like, if the cops ask you something, don't tell them, because that's going to get a whole bunch of people in trouble who got nothing to do with this. You know, like abolition, I think, is actually the codified knowledge of oppressed people. So not academics, not folks who have all this formal training, but folks who are the ones actually interacting with these systems and know how they work better than anyone else does. So I think one of the ways that abolition has transformed me is it's helped me re-examine where I look for my sources of knowledge. It's helped me think about, like, if I'm white, if I'm anti-white supremacy and if I'm anti-colonial, then the academy is not who I should be trusting to disseminate knowledge to me. If I am anti-capitalist, if I'm anti-white supremacist, then like I need to be looking to my people. And a lot of my people don't have the training that I have. A lot of my people haven't had access to the spaces and the jargon that I have had access to, but it's actually their knowledge that I'm learning from. And it's actually their knowledge that I'm working in the tradition of and building off of. And that both requires my humility and also requires me to check myself in terms of what traditions, like Derica said, I'm actually trying to build off of and I'm actually trying to be in line with, and where I look, not just for my knowledge and my information, but also where I look to give my support. who I want to build with. And when I imagine a police and prison-free world, who I'm actually pulling in to help me expand my own imagining. Because it, again, cannot be the systems that are actually what produced the police and prison system. Those are not the systems that are going to help us imagine a police and prison-free world.
Whew. Thank you.
Wow.
That was beautiful.
Benji, really quickly. There is this, I love this so much, the codified knowledge of peoplehood. So there's this critique I read of abolition democracy from of Du Bois' conception of like abolition democracy that I love so much. And it's not so much a critique, but it was just like Du Bois, you know, you spend the bulk of your time talking about abolition democracy, but it's mainly these fights that are happening in DC among like these white, you know, seemingly progressive Republicans, when all this abolition and insurrection was happening on the ground with these Black people who fled plantations, who went and did not wait for land to be redistributed, who like fought for it and took it. And it was one of the first times that I read a critique of abolition, of slavery abolition, that made me feel seen. And I hate when people say feel seen. I don't even like that language, but I'll say affirmed, when I felt affirmed by that. And I was like, yeah, I feel like there's something missing from what we're trying to use here. And when I read that, it was like from this communist papers in like the 40s and 50s. He said, yes, like we need to look to these other traditions of freedom, right? And not just like these sets of abolitionists who were committed to colonialism, who were committed to white supremacy, who were committed to capitalism. And so just hearing you say that reminds me so much of that critique. And I just have to say thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you for that critique, or for telling us about the critique. Dylan, how has your life changed? And your book.
Right
and
on.
The book that you and Derek are in.
Yeah, well, y'all put it up already. There's the book that Derek
cool.
and I contributed to, which is edited by Colin Kaepernick and company, called Abolition for the People. Y'all pick it up. It's coming out around the same time that Dereka's book is coming out, actually. I finished a book that just came out a few months in the fall called White Reconstruction, Domestic Warfare and the Logic of Genocide. You hear me kind of talking about some of the arguments here in a certain crystallized version. But in a way, in the book, I also do talk about your question, Kristianna, which is, you know, how has, I'm kind of rephrasing your question, but how does abolition constitute your life? That's how I would prefer to think about it, and I'll say why. Part of it is because I'm Pinoy, I'm Filipino. I'm the first one in my either side of my family that was born stateside, which means that a lot of us that are born to such families grew up Catholic, which means I'm an ex-Catholic and always a recovering Catholic, which means I have to resist any conversion narrative, which is why I rephrase your question, right? Like, how's your life changed? Well, I'm gonna rephrase the question. So I'm gonna think about it. How does abolition constitute my life, right? How does it make my life? And I'll say with that biographical information or autobiographical information, you know, taking my own analysis seriously, it means I have to pick a side. Right. If you're actually taking the analysis of warfare seriously, it means you're obligated to pick a side. And then you also but you need to do more than that. Right. You need to pick your form of struggle that will defend and liberate the side that you have chosen. Right. And I'm being a little bit simplistic about it, but actually not that simplistic about it, I would argue. Right. I'm saying maybe there's more than just two sides for sure. But I do think this is how the United States as a condition of normalized war works. So I'll say that this is why I think in some ways, you know, me and people like me are already prepared and in some ways preconditioned to be recruited and invited into abolitionist work. Right. And I say this very purposefully to everybody that's watching and listening and reading this, because this is the work that we have to do with each other. We have to be capacious and generous and constantly invite people into the work. And I'll say it in part because one of the other ways that abolition has really defined how I relate to people around me is I believe that one of my purposes on this planet is to challenge anybody, everybody, anything that presumes alignment and alliance with the people I'm in community and in movement with, right? And I'm talking here about the violence of the presumption. that I'm around a lot of people all the time, not just in the university, so-called academic settings, but in organizing settings and movement settings and whatnot. I'm around a lot of people who presume alliance and alignment with me and with my people and me. And it's because they're anxious about the content of our collective vision and our desires. They actually don't want to fucking hear it, right? So they want to, you'll often hear a line like, well, we're all on the same side here. Right. And it's a way to preempt. That's violent. That's a violent act. Like, I know people don't mean it that way, but it really is. It preempts an actual discussion of what our visions and desires and imaginations are, coming back to the notion of imagination. So there's that. I feel like we're obligated to challenge presumptions, right? Presumptions all the time and everywhere. The other thing is being in abolitionist community with different organizations, different groups of people. It's completely overturned my early 20s concept, meaning when I was in my early 20s, conception of what a social movement is. It displaces kind of the conventional textbook definition of a social movement as being kind of mass demonstration and prominent charismatic leaders, usually male and cisgender and hetero, and so on and so forth. What abolition, taking seriously the abolitionist, tradition and history, means that abolitionist movement oftentimes, and maybe necessarily, does not look and feel like the paradigmatic social movements of the 1950s, 1960s, or anti-colonial struggles around the world, and so forth and so on. So that piece of it is really important as well. That what abolition as a logic of movement does, it's about proliferation. It's about proliferation across scales, across communities, across methods, across aesthetics. One of the communities that I've been honored to be in touch with over these last 6 months is the Strike MoMA movement. Based in New York City, right? A collective of abolitionist artists and makers who are challenging the hegemony and the dominance and the colonial and anti-Black institutionalization of philanthropy in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, which is, as they quickly educated me, this is one of the primary foundations that has like advanced, crystallized, and aestheticized the entire civilizational anti-Black colonial project. So people in movement, that's what movement looks like to me now, in part, among others. And the last thing I'll say, this echoes what Derek and Benji have already mentioned, is it's cultivated in me against my own personality, against my own wiring. It's cultivated a politics of humility, right? I don't perform humility that well. Okay, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about kind of performative humility. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about politics of humility. Where it's about understanding oneself as being responsible with others and to others, and being a learner, a student, somebody who, humility means you always have to study this stuff. You always have to be engaged in collective study and analysis, and maybe be willing to shift your position, and not be so ideologically static and whatnot. So I think it's those three things, right? It's challenging the violence of presumptions, especially liberal presumptions. It's changing the idea of what a movement is, what it looks like, what it feels like, and how it moves and reads, and then this politics of humility. I think all those things to me are central to what abolition creates for life worlds.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. So we're diving in on time. I think they're going to put up Benji's upcoming piece. Benji, do you want to talk about that really quickly before we close out? What your piece is?
Sure.
Your performance? Yeah.
I just thought I'd share that because I ain't got a book. I'm gonna try and get on y'all level, but I ain't got a book yet, so I ain't got no book to share. But I just dropped my website and the current project that I'm working on, which I think is good, frankly, to jump off Dylan's thing, because it's already been a real struggle to figure out where is a project or performance like this gonna live when so many of these spaces and these venues are like the heart of these systems of violence that we're talking about. But I'm working on a piece called World After This One, which I think is good connection to this conversation. I'm looking at bomba, which is Afro-Puerto Rican dance and music, gospel music, and Vogue, all as examples of Black art forms that use the materials of the present to imagine liberated futures. And for me, it feels like a very abolitionist project because so often we are trying to imagine liberation with these incredibly unliberated, not liberated conditions in which we're living. and doing that is very complicated. And I think Black folks in particular, Black artistry and Black creative traditions, not just political outwardly or on their face political traditions, but all Black traditions are engaged in this creative practice of imagining a world where Black people are free with the materials that are distinctly in opposition and in contradiction to Black freedom. And it's a movement and spoken word piece that's going to try and sort of delve into that.
Will it be online too? Or is it only going to be living? You don't know yet.
I have no idea yet, but
Okay.
it's also
Well,
probably coming out around in the fall. So everything's coming out in the fall.
Okay. Thank you. Like the gratitude that I have for this conversation cannot be understated. Just like so filled and so thankful for like the wisdom, the just everything that y'all shared in this space was just such a beautiful act of like existing. And so I just want to really thank you for that. And I'm gonna invite Elizabeth back because we're at time to like say goodbye to us.
Wow, I can't believe how fast time moves. I am sitting with so much wisdom and so much gratitude for you all for being here. And I've been thinking a lot about Grace Lee Boggs today. And while listening to y'all, the thing that was coming up for me was this beautiful thing she said, that you don't choose the times you live in, but you choose who you want to be, and you choose how you think. And I think about the way you all have challenged my thinking and invited in so much wisdom of lots of kinds, right? There's so many different kinds of knowledge and wisdom and creativity. So thank you all. We're going to keep going with this for the rest of the week. We have a packed week. I love what you said, Derek, about the purpose of revolution is to generate ideas. There's so many coming. So it's a treat to be with you all. On Wednesday, we're talking about imagining a world for all abilities. On Thursday, we have a Spanish language panel. It's about imaginando un mundo sin muros, jaulas y detención. Apologies to our ASL interpreters for the language switch. Talking about a world without walls, jails, and detention. And on Friday, we have a whole day packed full of events around Black futures. So there's lots and lots of work ahead, and also celebration. Benji, you mentioned Bomba, Movimiento Cultural is coming on Wednesday to the Green. We have Bomba on the Green. We have music tonight right after this. You can find all of this out at artidea.org. We also want to continue to hear from everybody who's watching, your ideas, everything you're coming to this, you're a part of this as well through virtual space. We have a survey. We want to hear everything about what's going on for you. So it's artidea.org/survey. So without anything else, thank you so much. And hopefully I will see you all very soon. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Love all you, man.
Picture me growing freely, no ceiling, no roof. Going